Okay, Peter, we're live with Politics in the Pub.
Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm the MC for tonight's Sydney Politics in the Pub. Unfortunately, we're not in the pub because of the COVID-19 public health orders. So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. And I want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the forum tonight. So Hotel Harry is shut because of the Sydney public health orders, and this is completely online. Welcome to everyone who's been able to join tonight. If you want to put a question or make a comment in the Q&A part of the program, you need to use the chat facility in YouTube, which you can find by clicking on the promo slide of tonight's event at politicsinthepub.org.au. Tonight's topic is China, a big threat to our future or a misunderstood hegemon. Well, the talk of conflict with China is in our media almost every day, and so today isn't exceptional. Australia's government, along with many others, have rebuked the Chinese government for recent cyber attacks on the Microsoft Exchange software. We on the Politics in the Pub committee are deeply concerned at the war with China talk and the dominance of the media by war propaganda rather than balanced information which would assist the public to cope with this situation and to push back to better define just what the tensions at work are, what are the best ways of addressing these issues to ensure that we have a peaceful and prospering world community. Our speakers tonight are both deeply informed about China, its history, culture, and current policies and strategies. Let's listen carefully and then, despite the limits of online formats, have a productive Q&A session. So let me introduce the speakers. First of all, we will have Professor Jocelyn Chey. She began as a lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Sydney in 1973, before she moved to Canberra once Australia first established diplomatic relations with China. For more than 20 years, she worked on the Australia-China relations in the Department of Trade and Foreign Affairs and was posted 3 times in China and Hong Kong, concluding with an appointment as Consul General in Hong Kong between 92 and 95. She was the key administrative officer in the Australia-China Council at the time it was founded in 1979. From 1988 to 92, she worked outside the public sector as the director of the China branch of the International Wool Secretariat. Now retired from public service, Jocelyn is adjunct professor at the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. She's a visiting professor excuse me, at the University of Sydney and adjunct professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a consultant on Australia-China relations. She's a frequent speaker and lecturer on Chinese affairs. She was awarded an Australia-China Council Medal for contributions to the development of the relations between our two countries in November 2008. She became a member of the Order of Australia, AM, in 2009, and a fellow of the Institute of International Affairs in November 2009. So we're really privileged to have you here, Jocelyn, tonight. Okay. Our second speaker is Dr. David Brophy. He's a senior lecturer in modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney. He studies the social and political history of China's northwest, particularly the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and its connections with the Islamic and Russian worlds. After finishing his PhD in 2011, he spent 2 years as a postdoctorate fellow at the Australian Centre on China in the World at the ANU, before coming to the University of Sydney in 2013. His first book is called Uyghur Nation in 2016, is on the politics of Uyghur nationalism between China and the Soviet Union in the early 20th century. So Jocelyn and David are each going to speak for about up to 20 minutes, and then we will move to the Q&A through to our finishing time around 7:15 p.m. So please let us welcome Professor Jocelyn Chey to the microphone. Over to you, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everyone. So I want to tell you a love story. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a happy ending. Actually, I've been asked to talk about whether China is a threat to our future or if this is all a big misunderstanding. And as Peter said, I'm someone who's been involved in Australian relations with China for more than half a century. So I'd like to take you back to when it all started, because I think there are some lessons that we can learn, both for the present and the future, if we can just take a few minutes to review how we got to where we are today. And we need to do that. It is really urgent. I think there's a great possibility that Australia may slide into a new Cold War if we just believe what we're told by Canberra and by some sections of the media. That is, that China is striving for global dominance and has to be stopped. If we just use some common sense, then I think it need not happen that way. So it was Ronald Reagan who coined the term evil empire in 1983. And he was talking about the former Soviet Union. That was the time of the nuclear arms race that threatened to wipe out human civilization. Reagan blamed it entirely on the USSR and said that that was the focus of evil in the modern world. But in fact, at that time, both the US and the USSR were expansionist and aggressive. So there were faults on both sides. Now, when people apply that kind of Cold War language to the People's Republic of China, it's not exactly the same situation. But we should note that the US is still involved, even if we don't name it. And in fact, we can't talk about Australia-China relations without also thinking about US-China relations. In 2021, one of the most prolific local critics of China is Peter Hartcher, who writes in the Sydney Morning Herald. In 2019, he wrote a quarterly essay about China and said that Australia had woken up to the fact that China was a threat to our future. And that started when Obama accused Beijing of using, I quote, sheer size and muscle to force countries into subordinate positions. To me, that sounds a bit like saying that China's behaving a bit too much like the United States. And the United States, in fact, is more expansionist than China is. It has, for instance, 800 military bases in 80 countries around the world, whereas China only has one in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. And it's the United States that's had troops in Afghanistan for the last 20 years and only now is getting them home. Well, Hartcher is also very concerned about what he calls Chinese agents of influence in Australia. And in his essay, he quoted the head of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, who said, "It's quite clear to me that any person in political office is potentially a target. Now, I'm not trying to create paranoia, but there does need to be a level of sensible awareness. If people talk about how to define foreign interference in our political system, I used to get the comment, oh, we'll know it if we see it. But not necessarily, not if it's being done properly. There would be some that I don't know about." So according to Hartcher, Chinese Australians are not to be trusted. They are targets of united front tactics and suspect loyalty. Well, that's a very old trope. It was being trotted out against Chinese immigrants in the gold rush times. At that time, it was a desire to keep the Chinese out that brought the states together to federation. Australia felt exposed to Asian hordes then. And since the British withdrawal from the Far East and Trump's emphasis on making America great again, that kind of paranoia has returned. The barbarians are at the gates. But let's get back to that love story that I promised you. And it begins exactly 50 years ago. It was July 1971 when the opposition leader, Gough Whitlam, first went to Beijing, followed closely by Henry Kissinger. And I myself first went across the border into China with a delegation from the University of Sydney in November 1971. You can't imagine what China was like then. It was deep red. It was the last years of the disastrous Cultural Revolution, during which perhaps 2 million people died. But Whitlam didn't go there to endorse Mao's human rights abuses. He was there because he believed that China would emerge as a regional power and that Australian foreign policy couldn't ignore a land of then more than 800 million people. So we may understand why at that time some people questioned his judgment. But I did share his viewpoint then, and later on it proved to be well justified. I joined what was then the Department of Overseas Trade in early 72 with the task of implementing trade policy for a new relationship with China. We signed the first trade agreement the next year. We tried to sell China the Australian-made Nomad aircraft and Murray Grey beef cattle, and we helped China promote its exports. It was exciting. I'd say it was the beginning of an extended love affair. Of course, China had been hidden before behind what we called the bamboo curtain, and part of the attraction was that it was the great unknown. In 1975, I moved to Beijing to look after scientific, education, and cultural exchanges. There were a lot of cultural misunderstandings because it was something new for both sides, but we persisted and we made some breakthroughs because there was a good deal of goodwill on both sides. One breakthrough was the Chinese archaeological exhibition that toured Australia in 1977. It broke all attendance records and proved to the art galleries here that the public was ready to embrace Asian culture, was in fact year by year falling more deeply in love. By that time, Australia had better relations with China and more interesting and innovative than any other country. So I was invited to go to talk to the Canadians about how we handled our relations with China. We were way ahead of the United States. They only established diplomatic relations in 1979. So because China, in fact, needed Australia, and you could say that kind of loving overture that we made was reciprocated. Over the next decade, China changed enormously. We came into what was called the period of reform and opening up. Most state monopolies were abolished and the free market was encouraged. There seemed to be endless energy and a lot of investment capital was released. So there was global competition to do business with China. There was also economic deregulation in Australia. The dollar was floated in 83, which brought us more into the international markets. And since Britain had joined the European community, our trade with Europe was disrupted. Japan was already a major export destination, and East Asia came to rival Europe in importance for Australia. It's not surprising that when there were emerging opportunities in China, it looked like a godsend. There was a vision that our raw materials, minerals, wheat, and wool could be processed in China and the finished products re-exported to the world. If we continue with that love affair metaphor, you might say the two countries became engaged. And that's how people were talking at the time. Prime Minister Bob Hawke had an economic advisor, Ross Garnaut, who he posted as ambassador in Beijing. After he returned, he was asked to write a strategy paper for future relations with the region. It was called Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy, launched in Canberra in 1989. The scope of the paper was not just about trade and economic engagement. It recommended restructuring education, science, and culture so that we would engage more closely. When he launched the paper, Hawke said it was a blueprint for what he called our economic reconstruction and enmeshment with the dynamic Asia-Pacific region. But 1989 is also an important year in relations with China for another reason, a tragic event that most people call the Tiananmen Massacre, but in Beijing it's called the June 4th incident. Student-led demonstrations called for democracy, free speech, and a free press, and they were bloodily put down by the Chinese army. The abuse of human rights was condemned here and around the world. It was a stark reminder that even though China had changed in many ways, fundamentally its autocratic political structure was not changed. So you might say, if it was a love affair, the fiancée was still tied firmly to her mother's apron strings. Despite that blow to China's prestige of the Tiananmen Massacre, the engagement, what I've called the engagement, wasn't called off, but the dynamics changed. Australia had encouraged China to engage in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, in the World Trade Organization, to be more active in the United Nations, and to sign up to its various treaties and obligations. China had already sent students overseas, and in the 90s they were returning to take up positions in government and business. China was becoming more confident about how to deal with the outside world. But at home, they also had growing problems. Inequality and corruption, probably I would list first. And the demise of the Soviet Union in 1992 was a stark lesson to the Chinese Communist Party. The message that they took away was that the party had to retain control, and if there was any separatist sentiment, it should be stamped on promptly to preserve the unity of the state. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, which argued that Western liberal democracy reigned supreme. There was no room for any alternative. But there was, in fact, alternative. By the mid-90s, China was already presenting a clear path to development to the rest of the world. It offered aid to Africa and Latin America. Chinese companies launched on stock exchanges in Hong Kong and New York. Entrepreneurs were encouraged to invest and to expand overseas. Living standards rose, and people in China felt proud of their country's achievements. The end of British rule over Hong Kong in 1997 was regarded by people in China as a sign of Chinese ascendancy. The US began to realize that it was some real competition emerging, and that's perhaps encapsulated by another famous book from an American scholar, Samuel Huntington, 1996 book, Clash of Civilizations. But when the clash came, it wasn't where it was expected from China, but from fundamental Islamists. The destruction of the Twin Towers in New York in September 2001 changed everything. It challenged US hegemony. George Bush and his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, invaded Iraq and announced a war on terror that led eventually to that 20-year war in Afghanistan. John Howard invoked the ANZUS Treaty and declared Australian support for the US. When Bush called for North Korea to be included with Iran and Iraq in an axis of evil, that was too much, though, for Beijing, and they opposed it in the United Nations. However, there was a lot of sympathy for the war on terror. China was concerned about terrorism. There is a large Muslim population in China, particularly in the West, and they were increasingly influenced by fundamentalism. Now, David Brophy is much better placed than me to talk about this, so I won't say any more about it. But there were concerns about separatist movements in Tibet and Xinjiang. And there was a room for cooperation with the United States. As Bush said, in the moment of opportunity, a common danger is erasing old rivalries. So the quid pro quo for them supporting the American line against terror was that America reduced their pressure on China, and consequently there was less friction between the two countries. I would say from that point onwards, that what I've called the love affair between Australia and China was largely influenced and determined by relations between China and the United States. It started with Whitlam's vision, finding security in Asia, not security from Asia. That was overtaken by Howard's view, which was that in any situation, ANZUS came first. From that point onwards, the views of the Defence and Security Departments and their think tanks in Canberra concerning the management of our relations with China came to prevail over those of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Outwardly, the bilateral love affair continued. There were major cultural promotions. The Year of Australian Culture in China in 2010, and the Year of Chinese Culture in Australia in 2011. Malcolm Turnbull and Xi Jinping described the relationship as a comprehensive strategic partnership. That was 2014. A free trade agreement was signed in 2015. A trade mission from Australia with 750 companies visited China in 2016 and pulled off some big deals. More Chinese companies set up offices in Australia, and more students and migrants came here. But that was more than 5 years ago. In the last 5 years, the love affair has really been on the rocks. It seems that the in-laws in America would like the engagement to be called off. Last year, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, "The free world must triumph over this new tyranny, and securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time." Kurt Campbell, who is the White House Asian Policy Coordinator, is still keeping to that Pompeo line. And he said that China, through its trade sanctions and its wolf warrior diplomatic attacks, is trying to punish Australia by what he calls cutting us out of the herd. Australia's China policy conforms with or even anticipates the United States. Scott Morrison's attack on Beijing's influence over the World Health Organization and his call for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, which came after a call to Donald Trump, are clearly designed to please Washington and not Beijing. So is the engagement off? Are we sliding into another Cold War? I hope not.
Is that it, Jocelyn? Thank you thank you very much. Well, I think that was a brilliant presentation of this long relationship we've had. And I think we'll just hand straight over to David now, and then we'll continue the conversation with everybody. So please welcome David Brophy. You
Sorry,
need to
I'll unmute myself. Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation. I'm speaking from Bidjigal land in Western Sydney, and I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders of that community. Now, unlike Jocelyn, I don't have decades of experience in Australia-China relations. In fact, I've been relatively remote from the discussion for much of my time as an academic. I was really drawn into it in 2017 as both the situation in China and Australia deteriorated. So I'll try and chart things from that point up until the present day. What I saw back then was, on the one hand, a severe crackdown in Xinjiang, as Jocelyn said, the part of China that I know the best, crackdown that is ongoing and requires a response. And at the same time, a series of domestic flare-ups that were here in Australia that were woven into what, to my mind, seemed a very exaggerated narrative of China as an unprecedented and unparalleled threat to Australia. Now, not a lot of what people were talking about at that point was particularly new. Discussion of politicians being bought off, the risks of Chinese investment, China's pursuit of dissidents internationally, so on. If we think back to 2009, which some people point to as the last all-time low in the relationship, these kinds of issues were in the air. They were part of the discussion. So there's a question, why did things not tip towards confrontation at that point, but did in 2017? And I think it's fairly obvious that if we think back a decade ago, there was still confidence in American military dominance in Asia, that Australia could continue to profit from ties to China from behind a protective American shield. Now, since that time, the confidence in that position has been flagging, but it received a particular hit, I think, in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, which, you know, with his America First rhetoric, this sense that America might be turning isolationist and reducing its commitment to allies such as Australia. So in that situation, what I'd like to point out is that I really think that Australia has its own initiative in this kind of position. I don't see Australia simply as responding to signals or pressure coming from Washington. In line with its historic posture of reliance on an imperial patron, be it Britain or the US, its response has been to try to catalyze a revived US-led response, because of course Australia's actions themselves can't be decisive. And that explains the noisy quality of Australia's response. It doesn't just want to get tough on China, it really wants to be seen to be getting tough on China and encourage the rest of the world to do the same. Now, the centerpiece back in 2017 was, of course, the Sam Dastyari scandal, in which the ALP senator went off message on the South China Sea to land a large donation from a donor from China who had Australian PR, Mr. Huang Xiangmo. This was a pretty disreputable thing to do, but not, I would say, something particularly unique for the ALP. What is often lost sight of is that this was actually a response to Stephen Conroy, who had similarly gone off message on the South China Sea, in his case to push the ALP in a more hawkish direction. Conroy did this in a speech in Washington, where he was a guest of the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, which is a pro-US lobby group. So what I'm pointing to here is that these are, in a sense, mirror events. There are perks involved on both sides. They're both delivering a message to keep distinct constituencies happy. In terms of the policy debate, Conroy's was a much more significant intervention. In fact, you know, Dastyari went to some length to keep his press conference secret, so that it wouldn't actually impact on the policy discussion. So what I want to say here is that there's no need to deny that there are people with pro-PRC proclivities active in Australia, or with links to the Chinese Communist Party. What we should not do, though, is to remove these facts from a wider context in which all sorts of lobbies are active, and indeed some that I would say were much more effective than China's. But anyway, it was on this basis that the foreign interference legislation was introduced. I won't discuss it in detail, but I'll be happy to in the Q&A. Suffice it to say that I see this legislation as far too wide-ranging in its scope and draconian in its penalties. Occasionally, lip service was paid to what they call a quote-unquote country-neutral response to foreign interference, but that fell by the wayside pretty quickly. These laws have been applied exclusively to people of Chinese background, to expel Chinese people from the country, including academics, to conduct raids on journalists. These are practices that we associate with China, but now we must, come to terms with the fact that Australia also engages in this too, and there are prosecutions commencing. Foreign interference has replaced terrorism as the new rationale for Australia's security agencies and their expanding powers as the war on terror winds down. And to some degree, this, I think, must be considered a factor motivating Australia's turn on China. Very quickly, the wider stigmatizing effect of this legislation and the climate that had to be whipped up in order to simply get the legislation through was being felt among Chinese Australians. In the name of things like Australian values, calls were soon aired to restrict immigration from the People's Republic of China. Now, Jocelyn already raised Peter Hartcher. He was among those calling for this measure, and he does so again in his recent book. Now, Hartcher quite disingenuously tries to shield himself from the charge of racism by arguing that we should take in more ethnic Chinese just from places outside the People's Republic of China to make up for the shortfall. But as Jocelyn has pointed out, political loyalties have always been part of the justification for white Australia policies. And I think a solution like Hartcher's really only becomes thinkable as part of that racist tradition. A thought experiment here can help to help us to see that. Now, I'm a critic of American war making, and it may well be the case that on average, American immigrants to Australia are more patriotic, pro-US than the average Australian. Now, imagine if on that basis, I said that, to prevent Australia getting involved in future wars alongside America, we should reduce American migration to Australia. Now, I'd expect to be ridiculed for saying something like that, but this is evidently an acceptable way to talk about Chinese migration. Evidently acceptable, I say, because both the foreign minister and the shadow foreign minister launched that book. Labor's Penny Wong was happy to be associated with a book arguing for a cut in immigration from the PRC. Now, COVID, of course, exacerbated this climate of hostility towards Chinese Australians. We saw with the arrival of the pandemic, the notion of Chinese Australians as a fifth column merged with hostility to them as carriers of a disease, which is also a long-standing trope. I won't quote the statistics at you, but they show that a large proportion of the Chinese Australian community has suffered vilification or worse during the pandemic. Now, I don't think it's right to say that Australia's response to China is motivated by racism, but it clearly feeds off a set of discourses that have never been far below the surface and is likely to continue to exacerbate these enmities. Again, to make an analogy here, it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, just as it's not racist to criticize the Chinese government's policies. But if Australia was to whip up a panic that Israel was on the brink of commandeering Australia's institutions and that Australia needed to center its foreign and military policies on an effort to stand up to Israel, well, I think it's very likely that that would breed anti-Semitism. And this is the situation that we find ourselves now with China and anti-Chinese racism. Okay, so let me zoom out again to the wider context. COVID was seen by some as some sort of providential rupture at first. You might remember that this would slow the Chinese economy and prove the superiority of the West's democratic system. Neither of those things can really be said to have come to pass, prompting then something of the opposite position, increasing worries that China was getting a jump on the West. The COVID blame game obviously intensified hostilities, but by the time Morrison aired his COVID inquiry thought bubble, Australia for a couple of years had not only been making policy on the basis that China was an enemy that needed to be confronted, but telling the world that as well. I see COVID really as the last straw for China, the COVID inquiry, which then led it to hit back with a series of anti-dumping investigations. Now, this situation has brought the debate back to some of the more basic questions of Australia-China relations. For example, the cost involved in a confrontational stance towards Beijing, and away from some of those micro scandals of 2017, 2018 that were driving the debate pre-COVID. Having said that, the effect of all that sensationalist rhetoric and reporting is very much being felt, such that pundits have been able to claim that every measure the Australian government has taken towards China up to this point has been an essential defense of sovereignty, and therefore that no modification of policy is possible. Sovereignty, of course, is a term beloved of conservative governments, and I think this is really a key misconception here. China is not going to attack or invade Australia, but equally at no point in this debate has China got its hands on policy making in Australia. There has been no serious compromise of Australian sovereignty. All the decisions involved remain in Australian hands. As an aside, I have to point out, if there is any issue of sovereignty in this context, it involves the presence of American troops and military facilities on Australian soil, which may render debate as to Australia's participation in military conflict with China moot. Now, even there, though, this all reflects decisions made by Australians that could be undone by Australians. So even there, I don't think there's too much need to get het up about sovereignty. Talk of sovereignty in relation to China, I really see as a cynical ploy to bully people into supporting the government line. This talk boils down to the claim that because China is critical of Australian policy, therefore Australians must defend it. And of course, this kind of logic goes hand in hand with efforts to accuse domestic critics in Australia of doing China's bidding. Now, personally, it would be a mistake, I believe, to argue something like, well, that confrontation with China is costing Australia's exports, so we should end it. Some people do make arguments like that, of course, but we really don't need to. The point is, regardless of what China thinks of what Australia is doing, the course that Australia is on is bad for Australia. It's making us less safe, it's endangering civil liberties, and it's stoking racism. Now, I wish no one would be happier if Australia was standing up for human rights and democracy, but it's not. It's seeking to advance a great power rivalry as the junior ally of one of the contestants, and with ambitions of its own to maintain a hegemonic role in the Pacific region. None of this can be expected to advance the cause of human rights and democracy, even if it is making Australians more aware of the dire state of both those things in China, which it is. Things are bad in China these days, but the trend for democracy in Australia is downwards as well. And that's what you get when you sign up for a period of heightened interstate competition. I've already mentioned Hartsh's proposals to slash immigration from China. Some of his other proposals are also disturbing. To introduce security checks for anyone running for office in Australia, for example. So not every citizen should be entitled to run for office in Australia. And he also wants to entrench the already strong bipartisanship on foreign policy by further removing foreign policy questions from public debate and entrusting them to what he calls a strategic council of politicians and experts. So too much debate, too much democracy becomes a bad thing, something that China might take advantage of. This is the mindset. Now, the actual fact is, of course, we're not seeing much debate in Parliament right now. The ALP, for certain audiences, is doing what it can to give an impression of discomfort with Morrison's policies without actually offering any substantial critique. The Greens, for their part, are quite divided, with some speaking strongly against the current direction, others seemingly quite comfortable with it, usually on the misguided assumption that the West is interested in defending human rights. Now, as I've said, the situation has revealed certain truths about China. The repression in Xinjiang is not made up. It's very serious. Jocelyn is right to point to the history of collaboration between China and the West on counterterrorism, but that has had disastrous results for the people of Xinjiang, as for other communities around the world. The events in Hong Kong represent a setback for the cause of democracy globally. Taiwan finds itself in a precarious position now. We've also learned certain things about Australia. It's true that politicians and business elites have at times been too cozy with China. All of these things are things that we need to factor into our stance towards China going forward, but none of these things justify the current antagonistic posture that we've taken, nor could they possibly justify any Australian involvement in a future war with China. In the absence of clarity from politicians on this, we need more Australians to stand up and register their dissent with what is a reckless and dangerous course of action. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, David. At this point in the pub, we would all be applauding and saying thank you very much, very warmly. I think we've had really two, fine presentations which have made us really see a bigger picture and think about the broad range of principles involved, and see some of the manipulations that we're trying to deal with every day in the media. So now it's time for the Q&A. I've got a few questions in the chat from the YouTube come through, and I encourage the participants to go there and make some comments or put some questions. But the first one is a bit broad. It says, can you talk about Five Eyes as it is before and as it is today? So this is very open-ended. I would just add that it seems like the decision to ban Huawei from Australia's 5G network was made by the heads of the Five Eyes intelligence agencies rather than anyone else. But how do you see it playing out? What are they doing? Both of you should turn your mics on and just talk.
Yeah, well, the Five Eyes was originally a security grouping for exchanging confidential and classified information. I never heard it. In fact, I thought we were not even supposed to mention it, not to reveal that it existed. But certainly it's no secret anymore. So I can say, that for instance, when I was in my last posting, if I had any material classified material came over my desk and it was stamped Five Eyes, then I knew that it was only to be shared with basically the Anglophone small group that shared classified information. It's only the Morrison government that has decided to build the Five Eyes into something bigger. They're trying to make it more like a treaty strategic organization to collaborate on all kinds of matters. It's a very strange. To me, it seems like what I talked about, how our international relations has been taken over by the defense and strategic policy institutes, in Canberra. And in particular, it seems to be aimed at building up an alliance, a unified view that can be presented to China. So we don't just say, you know, the Australian view is, but we also have our partners also confirming and endorsing the same line. So it's, in fact, it's interesting. I think let us just take an example. If we are going to talk to China about some human rights abuses, which we used to do, and we had a human rights dialogue, that dialogue wasn't very effective. But if the same issues were raised by a number of other countries, then they carried much more weight. They had to be dealt with at a higher level in the Chinese ministry. So not just by the people on the Australia desk, but, you know, take it higher up the line. That's fair enough. But what is the point of Australia taking up issues which are discussed with the United States and with Britain? Why aren't we discussing them with Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, other countries in our region? And then there we would very quickly find that each one of them has their own way of dealing with China, and they don't necessarily want to be drawn into endorsing an American point of view, because they also, while they share a lot of our concerns, but they have to work out a modus vivendi. They have to get on with China in a practical way. So that sort of works against Five Eyes is like a more comfortable, you know, group for Canberra to deal with.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Do you want to add anything to that, David?
I think that was a pretty good response. I think that we see around the question of the Five Eyes, the way that there are always competing priorities to do with the way issues like human rights get discussed. I mean, the Five Eyes and the emphasis that it's given, that's really a question of maintaining the solidarity of the Anglosphere towards China. And that's why, you know, pressure gets applied to a country like New Zealand, for example, that obviously doesn't feel the need for everything involving China to be channeled through its relationship with these other English-speaking countries. And I think for quite good reason. I mean, you had these Five Eyes statements on China, on human rights or so, which, you know, was signed by Mike Pompeo, former head of the CIA. Now, if you were going to say something to China on human rights, would you want your signature next to Mike Pompeo, or would you rather put out an independent statement, putting some distance between yourself and the United States, and thereby preserving a bit of credibility on questions of human rights? I mean, this is the sort of the ridiculous situation that we're pushing countries like New Zealand into by this heightened emphasis on the Five Eyes. All it really says to the world is that everything involving China for the West is viewed through this prism of security and national security. And that's to my mind the last way that you would want to advance a credible position on something like human rights.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Evan Hughes. So it's two parts. At a recent forum, a former senior Australian diplomat assessed that there is limited scope for vocal Australian criticism on Chinese abuses of human rights when our own practices are questionable. Does Australia have a sound footing criticising the situation in Xinjiang when our asylum seeker and Indigenous incarceration policies are so wanting? So maybe we could start with you, David, on that.
Yeah, those are all fair criticisms. I mean, I understand completely where that perspective comes from. When I'm talking about these issues, I am not necessarily presenting policy options to government. You know, my first audience when I talk on China is to the Australian public. And I think that, you know, we collectively need to talk about question of how do we roll back the damaging effects of the international war on terror, whether the actors involved be the Chinese government or the US government, or what have you. I mean, I sort of see these things as part of the same task. What do I think about Australian politicians saying things? Look, I think it's better that they say something than nothing. It's an interesting philosophical question. Is hypocritical criticism better than no criticism at all? Probably. But I think that we get a little bit caught up at the moment with this question of, who is saying what and how loudly they're saying it. Australia, even now in this situation of confrontation, questions of human rights still rate very low on the list of priorities. They'll sign on to statements, go through the motions, but they're not interested in hosting any serious conversation about how we might, improve conditions for oppressed minorities in countries like China or elsewhere. That's a conversation I'm interested in having. It's not a simple one, but I don't think the current government is really interested in opening that up. So,
can I add something?
Yes, Jocelyn, please go ahead.
I think there are two aspects that need to be considered. One is the philosophical and one is the practical. China does. They have their own white paper on human rights. Okay, so the concept is understood at a government level, and I don't know how widely in the community, but there is some general understanding of the principle. However, China doesn't believe in universal human rights. They have their own concept of the order in which those rights should be classified. And they put first economic rights. So I'm not defending their point of view, but just stating what the Chinese view is, which is that bringing people out of poverty, giving them a secure economic basis for their life, is to them should rank above other rights like free speech and the free press and so on. Now, we believe that, and I believe that human rights are universal. As Shylock said in the Shakespeare play, do I not bleed? If someone is in prison, it doesn't make any difference. Shouldn't make any difference whether they're put in. If they're imprisoned unjustly, it shouldn't make any difference whether that happens in China or it happens in Australia or in Palestine. It should be approached in the same way, and a human life should be given equal value wherever in the world somebody needs to live. So when we talk about human rights with China, we've got to start at that very fundamental level of defining what we mean by human rights. And it's not an easy discussion to have. On the practical level, so as I said, we used to have a dialogue on human rights, and we had some programs, for instance, bringing Chinese judges to Australia for a practical experience and short-term education courses. And we were making some progress, but that dialogue has finished years ago, and unless we get our overall relationship with China in order, it's not going to start again. So at the moment, we are not getting very far at all with any discussion of human rights, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. The next question is more, it's from Kathy. It says, how can Australia work with China to divert the headlong jump over the obvious climate cliff? So this is a shift of the focus about where we could work together. Jocelyn, would you like to start with that one?
Well,
can I just say that, sorry, that question is not from me, I'm afraid. I forgot to put in the name of the user. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it is.
Okay. Go ahead, Jocelyn, there.
Well, you know, if we really want to maintain a dialogue with China, it's best to choose some area of practical cooperation where both sides stand to benefit, and working on the challenges of the climate, global climate crisis sounds like a very sensible place to start to me. China actually is doing quite a lot, and in the past we have had exchanges in this area. For instance, in agriculture, in the maritime environment. I mean, fisheries, and there is a growing interest in China in sustainable agriculture and in environmental issues, both at a public level as well as a government level. So it would be an excellent place for us to resume some kind of dialogue and cooperation. Yeah.
Thank you. And David, have you got any comment on that angle at all?
I feel like the question of collaboration is something that I don't put a huge amount of emphasis on, actually, in my discussion. I think that Australia's relationship with China will take on whatever shape it does. The key thing for us to recognize is our responsibility on our side to take, to counter the politics that are driving the situation towards a zero-sum competition. And that's going to have disastrous consequences in many spheres. There's a debate out there right now. There was a letter a couple of weeks ago by a group of organizations in the US, including some climate organizations in the US, saying that for the sake of climate cooperation, we need to drop the saber rattling towards China. And that provoked quite a furious response from people sort of poo-pooing the idea that there needs to be collaboration, or that could be collaboration with a place like China, so on. And I really think this is a very dangerous way of thinking about the situation. China has a very coldly realist view of international politics. And if you do the calculations, there's a finite amount of carbon that we can safely pump into the atmosphere before we pass the point of no return and burn the planet. Any expectation that China has of future conflict with a superpower like the United States is going to shift its thinking on how much and how quickly it wants to consume those resources. This is, as long as China has this in the back of its mind that it faces a threat of containment or worse from the West, it's going to push down question of environmental response down its own list of priorities, and that's disastrous for the world. That's the situation that we're facing right now. Having said that, of course, Australia is, if there's one question on which we really need to look in the mirror, it's definitely climate. So, we have a lot to do to turn around this country to play a more positive role on international climate negotiations.
Yes, that's right. Okay, I've got a couple of other questions that are a bit similar to what we've already done, but there's one here, it's more on the positive side. The question is to both of you. How do we normalize our relationship with China, despite the reality that the US, European Union influence will always be within our defense and foreign policy, no matter which party is in power? So it's more a question like, where's the positive initiative that we could take to shift the balance back? So David, why don't you start there?
Well, it's hard to see much on the horizon at the moment. I don't think there's anyone in the major parties who are willing to really lay out the questions that we're facing and argue for a different alternative, because it does involve confronting notions. I think that a lot of people in Canberra find it unthinkable, really, that Australia could get by in the world without its relationship to the United States. And that is one possible corollary to the rise of China. I mean, if China does what powers do and translate their economic weight into political influence in East Asia, then its role will gradually be diminished, and therefore the relevance of Australia to American interests will decrease, possibly to the point at which, you know, the ANZUS alliance becomes even more of a dead letter than it already is. And I think this anxiety is really what is driving Canberra right now. And I think that the problem is that, having advertised itself as offering a model of how to respond to China and being very sort of proud to be out on the front line, taking on China and telling the rest of the world what a great job we're doing of standing up to China, Australia's put itself in this position where it's actually very hard for it to back down now, because that would have wider significance. That would be seen as a significant breakthrough for China, for Australia to shift back to a more conventional engagement position. And I don't think, I don't see people in Canberra who are willing to to take that on politically. So, we have to watch closely US-China relations. I don't think a detente between the two powers is around the corner, but stranger things have happened. We are conscious of the fact that, America can change its positions quite remarkably, usually without informing Australia. And Australia will find itself, isolated on this question. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. What I really hope we can avoid is that, these questions being resolved by some kind of crisis, which, if we just let things coast, is the way that they will get resolved. Some sort of, flashpoint emerging at which, questions of military escalation come to the fore. We don't want to find ourselves in that position. For the time being, then, I think we just have to sort of recognize that foreign policy it's a realm of policy making that is really removed from democratic input. And I don't think most Australians are comfortable with the idea of sleepwalking into confrontation with China. But ordinary Australians really don't have much say in this question. So, like most fields of policy making, we need to try to actually prise open this discussion a bit more, so that sentiment that something is going wrong here can actually be translated at the political level.
Thank you, David. Jocelyn, have you got any ideas about this, an alternative pathway? Yeah.
Well, I do, but just following on David's last point about, ordinary people have got to make sure that this point is raised, so that, for instance, in the next election, whether that happens later this year or next year, in the last election, nothing was said about China relations. but I really think it's become such an important issue that the parties should focus on this, and we as the electors should be asking our local candidates, how they see these issues. That's the chance for us to get people to be more pragmatic about it. I'm not terribly optimistic at the moment. I note that our ambassador to China has just given a talk to the Australian community in the business community in Shanghai, in which he said that he expected that Australia would remain in the deep freeze as far as China was concerned for the next 5 years or so. Mm-hmm. The business community admitted that it was no longer advantageous for them to, for instance, to hand out koala bears or kangaroo pins or something. If they wanted to get by, they did sort of disguise the fact that they were Australian representatives. It's very sad when we've got to that point of view. On the other hand, they have come together as the quite considerable Australian expatriate community in China, and are talking about forming a new sort of, not quite a lobby group, but an association, and expressing more the point of view of those people who are engaged on a day-to-day basis in doing business with China. And that's good, because, we haven't talked about the politics and the trade, but generally speaking, a lot of our politicians in Canberra seem to think that we can take on China politically, but we can still sell them stuff. And that it doesn't work that way. I mean, in fact, a lot of the trade issues that we've had with China on wine or seafood or whatever, barley, we've ended up losing because China has been sourcing those from other countries. Chilean wine is doing very well in China, and American barley has profited at the expense of Australian barley growers. So we've got to bring all these things together and look at it in a holistic way. So next elections is the time to do it, I think.
Okay, thank you. I've got another different question. How many of us have Asian friends and neighbours? How do we avoid making them our enemy next door? So this goes back to, the impact of Peter Hartcher's arguments and his statements and book. So very briefly, would you like to talk about that one, Jocelyn?
Well, yes, it's a considerable part of the Australian population now. The ethnic Chinese population might be as much as even 5% of, and it's the largest in Sydney, where we are speaking from Sydney. The Chinese community is the largest sort of ethnic group in Sydney, outside the sort of Anglo-Saxon European group. So I think all of us have got Asian friends and neighbors. And if you look at our schools, my grandchildren don't have any trouble at all. To them, it's not an issue whether somebody is from India or Indonesia or China. They're all friends. And I think we should go out of our way at the moment to make it clear to our Chinese friends and neighbors that, we are not harboring prejudice. We don't regard them as being plague carriers or undercover spies.
Okay. And David, have you got any other angle on that one?
Well, it's all tied up with everything we've been discussing. I don't think it's going to be easy for Australia to avoid marginalizing and vilifying its Chinese Australian population if it continues on this path to Cold War with China. I mean, you have once you start legislating things like the foreign interference legislation, simply just kind of justify doing that, you need to maintain this steady flow of stories about Chinese agents, people infiltrating the political system and so on. And I think we can expect, the security agencies have essentially been given carte blanche to feed their message into the media and received a very credulous reception from sections of the Australian media. And of course, it's in their interest to continue stoking these kinds of narratives and contributing to this climate in which people come to view Chinese Australians as a fifth column. It's in their political interests, it's in their material interests for them to keep doing that. So I think we need to, I think part of the response has to be rolling back some of these steps that we've taken, like the foreign interference legislation, like this increasing centralization of power in Canberra, the expansion of this ministerial fiat in the name of the national interest, the new Foreign Relations Act. All of these things are, embedding a paranoia towards China in the structure of Australian politics, and that's going to find an outlet on the street. Unfortunately, we also need to be very skeptical of this language of Australian values, which is the way a lot of the sort of the more sophisticated expression of this xenophobia. This is a term that really only goes back to the war on terror. So it's first used to exclude Muslim Australians from the sort of imagined community of people possessing Australian values, and it's now being applied to Chinese Australians. Individuals have values, countries don't have values. And I'm very confident, when I look at the sort of policies that people in the government today are pushing, I'm very confident that I have different values to some of those members of the government. And I'd be also quite confident in saying that my values would probably align, much more closely to a lot of ordinary people in China than it would with people like Peter Dutton. We can't get sucked into this language of Australian values versus Chinese values. It really just opens the gateway to the more punitive discourses of loyalty and so on that get applied to these migrant communities.
Okay. Thanks. So we're getting close to the end here. I've got a bit of input from myself. I look at the trade relations as part of my own work and other things. And it seems to me it could be a case that the Chinese government has been very restrained. It's doing tit for tat, but it's sort of quite measured, very small. For instance, on the barley, the wine, the seafood, the things going to the WTO, China's doing 2 of them, but Australia's, I think, taken out 17 or more cases, anti-dumping cases and things which are leading to the WTO disputes panel as well. So there's quite an asymmetry in that one. Australia did ban Huawei. I don't think China's done anything equivalent. But it's rhetorically, it keeps on saying Australian government should really be careful what it says. It should restrain itself and so on. So is it fair really to look at it and say the Chinese are angry or they're reacting, but they're reacting in a fairly moderate way compared to what could happen? Huh? Could I ask you that, David, and then I'll put it to...
Yeah, sure. Well, I think you're right that China was relatively slow to respond because China's analysis has always been that there is no basic conflict of interest between China and Australia. I think they were initially bemused to see the direction Australia was going in, and gradually that bemusement turned into anger and hostility to the point where they did start to take action. Now, you're quite right about the the anti-dumping actions. I think the tally is more like 6 versus around 100. I believe. So if taking an anti-dumping action is a hostile act, well, Australia is engaged in much worse towards China. Were China's actions politically motivated? Yes, almost certainly. Has Australia's actions to restrict Chinese economic activity in Australia being politically motivated? Well, yes, I think so. I think so too. Right. So this is a this is a tit for tat situation, and I do think it's troubling when we're in that kind of situation that there are, the possibility that there can be decisions taken, actions carried out by, for example, security agencies in Australia that will have consequences for, that will produce a response from the Chinese side. And we can be quite in the dark about a lot of what is going on. That's one dangerous element of this situation. I mean, just to go back to the point about sovereignty, again, as I said, Australia has many more anti-dumping actions against China. If such an action is an infringement of sovereignty, then we're obviously infringing much more on China's sovereignty. These kinds of, criticizing, sometimes even, China, the fact that China is criticizing or presenting its grievances to Australia, even this is sometimes presented as an infringement of Australian sovereignty. This, again, if that's the case, well, then Australia is trampling on Chinese sovereignty all the time when it complains about Chinese actions. For us to start thinking this way, that because China is taking these actions, we're under attack, our sovereignty, our independence is at stake. This is, to my mind, just shows the way that this competition is producing a convergence in the way of thinking about politics on both sides. Because, of course, China says all the time that, well, criticizing us on human rights, that's an infringement of our sovereignty. We've got ourselves in the situation now in Australia where we're talking very similarly that, China saying it doesn't like our policies, that is, that is infringing on our sovereignty. And this is going on in so many different spheres, this really stupid convergence taking place between the way we talk about politics on both sides.
Okay, thank you. Jocelyn, have you got any thoughts about this measured tit for tat situation, how it's measured?
Well, basically, I agree with most of what David says. I think that there are, one of the issues that we haven't really covered is that as the Chinese economy has developed, and as people's living standards in China have risen, and as China has become more prominent in international affairs, the Chinese people feel quite justifiably proud of their achievements. And in addition to that, the Chinese Communist Party has been stoking kind of nationalism. So there is, while we've been talking a lot about how Australia is in danger of sliding into a kind of Sinophobia, we call it, anti-China feeling, there is also already in China itself quite an undercurrent of anti-foreign feeling, that they do feel that the rest of the world is out to get them. And when it comes to issues which are particularly sensitive to the party and that the party has been spruiking, like reunification with Taiwan, if a foreign government leader, such as the Japanese Prime Minister, makes a statement which is translated into Chinese and put in the Chinese media and taken as an attack on Chinese sovereignty, the local population will explode, and that's very difficult for the Chinese government themselves to keep a lid on that nationalist fervor, which they have been stoking themselves. So they ought to take the responsibility for controlling it. But it is a bit of a powder keg in China, and I think we have to be particularly careful when it comes to our leaders making statements on some of those sensitive issues. Not so much human rights, but Taiwan is a particular one case that's in the press today. So that's why I mentioned that one.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And we've come to the end of our time for the Q&A and the session. So I want to really express our appreciation from Politics in the Pub to Professor Jocelyn Chey and Dr. David Brophy. It's been really an excellent discussion. I think it will be very helpful to our audience and a good contribution to the public debate we really need more of in Australia. So our next session is Tuesday, August 3, on the topic, where are we now with precarious work? So we're going back into the issues about the Australian social situation in the pandemic. The speakers would be Maxine Sharkey, General Secretary of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, and Jack Boutros, who's an organiser with the Transport Workers Union. So they're both talking about different segments of the workforce dealing with precarious work. So that begins at 6 o'clock sharp, August 3. Pandemic permitting, we'll be at the Hotel Harry, but it doesn't look likely. So the program for the second half of the year as a whole is on our websites. Please join our Politics in the Pub Facebook group to get notifications of events. And the videos of all our programs, including tonight's, are available at our politicsinthepub.org.au website. So thank you very much. Thank you to Kathy for the technical support. Thanks once again to Jocelyn and David. And good night, everybody.
Thanks, Peter.
Good night.